I am honored to be joined today by a distinguished guest who has focused dissertation on a really interesting topic that I'm glad we'll have some time to explore today. But we will start out quickly, as we always do, just have our guest introduce themselves really quick and give a brief overview of their professional background. So go ahead, Laura, take it away.
Well, Dustin, thank you so much for your time today. My name is Laura Arroyo. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm currently an acting assistant vice chancellor at the University of Colorado Boulder, which is a large flagship institution in Colorado, the state of Colorado. But I'm kind of from all over the place. I'm originally from the East Coast. I grew up in Pennsylvania, and I spent quite a bit of my time in New England and then also in the South. So I've kind of gone the gamut of institutions, both private and public. My bachelor's degree is in social work from Mansfield University, which is a small school, state school in Pennsylvania. And then my master's degree was also in social work from University of Maine. So I kind of came in through the back door, I think, of student affairs. My doctoral work is at the University of Colorado, Denver. So still part of our flagship and part of our institution. And it's specifically in educational equity and leadership, specifically with a focus on urban and diverse communities.
Yeah, well, and I wanted to kind of call out that I was born in Maine, and my wife, she studied higher education at University of Maine as well for her master's degree. So I saw that when I was looking over your LinkedIn. I was just like, I don't see that very often of like people that go to University of Maine. So it was, uh,
We're a small niche group, but we are holding tight. Maine's a lovely place. I adore it.
yes, I go back often. So, but yeah, so you've been focusing on kind of inclusion and residence life. I think particularly with Black students in residence life. So, if you want to just explain your dissertation work, sort of just high level, how it came to be, like why you chose that topic, and then we'll get into some of the details.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say probably for the last 10 to 15 years, a large part of my work has been very much, I almost say, student affairs or residence life adjacent. While it's sat within residence life, there's been a very large focus on faculty connections, living learning community development. Prior to CU Boulder, I worked at a smaller private institution in North Carolina called Elon University. Elon is currently, I think, through some of the kind of online ways, they're number one currently in living learning community development. So they're pretty well known. They do a lot of work with COO and promising practice work for living learning communities and best practices for first year students. So I cut my teeth there. Coming to CU Boulder, also continuing this work with faculty connections, faculty partnerships, working within residence life, but very much connected to identity-based work. When I started at CU Boulder, I've been here for about 6 years. When I started at CU Boulder, we were first developing our identity-based living learning communities specifically for Black college students. So we had previous identity-based LLCs for LGBTQIA students, a loose kind of multicultural community, but really on the cutting edge of developing a Black LLC, Black student LLC. And at a large flagship state institution that was pretty kind of the first in the Pac-12 and in our kind to do this work. But I started this role and quickly had to jump in and learn what I didn't know. I had been doing living learning community work for a long time, but it's a very different beast. It's a very different understanding to focus on identity instead of kind of that co-curricular academic experience. It's a different focus, very student driven. So kind of like fast forward a little bit, I was doing this work very much from a practical side, right? A practitioner side, and I really needed some of that academic side and understanding of how we do what we do. I felt that to really understand and make good movement for Black students, not knowing my identities as a white cis female, I really needed to think through, one, was I the best person to do this work? And also, if I am the person tasked to do this work at CU Boulder, how do I do this of the best of my ability? So, looking at doctoral programs, I also very much knew that for a doctoral program, I wanted to focus something that was a little bit out of the realm of a traditional higher ed program. So, I looked at programs that had an educational equity focus, programs that were more social work driven. I really fell into the program over at CU Denver, which is educational equity focused. And specifically, the track that I was on was urban and diverse communities. Um, and I knew pretty quickly, I would say within in the first couple of months in the program, that I was going to focus on living learning communities of some sort. Um, the reason why is because early in my doctoral program, I was talking with a student at CU Boulder, and the student lived within the identity-based LLC in on our campus. And the student said to me, "Laura, without the LLC, I could go a whole week at CU Boulder and never see another student that looks like me." And that just really it broke my heart. First of all, it was so upsetting that as a PWI we weren't making substantial movement to support our Black students in a larger way. And if you know anything about demographics in Colorado, our Black students across the state of Colorado are a small population. But it was just really concerning to me that we would not support a student in a deeper way in their identity. And my question, kind of, whenever you do a doctoral program, there's a question that you pose. And maybe that question isn't something that's stated, but it's in your head, right? My question was, how do we really support students outside of the identity-based LLC? If students can live and work and experience their academic experience and never see another student that looks like them for over a week, what do we do that's different? How do we help that experience? So that was kind of the start of this doctoral kind of journey and program and my dissertation. And then what I will say, the name of the dissertation was "Let Us Make It Ours: Black Student Mattering at a Predominantly White Institution." Um, the "Let Us Make It Ours" is a pretty critical part of that dissertation name because, digging into this topic, it became very clear and very evident that me sitting within my identity, sitting in a position of power at an institution, would have all sorts of concerns in doing this research. So I really needed to lean into a peer-to-peer kind of study model that's really supporting students to let them make it ours. And that name was titled and chosen by the students that participated within this study.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it just makes me think there's a lot of kind of emotional parts of it, like what that student told you. But I'm sure, thinking through kind of putting like something like this into action, making it, policy, creating living learning communities at institutions across the nation. Like there's like a lot of things about this that makes it important because like you would certainly think, yeah, where it's like, well, yeah, we want to recruit a more diverse student body. We want to retain, just more of our students in general and stuff. So things like this are strategies that you would implement to do that. So, um, yeah, I mean, that's really powerful. And I think just to kind of to your credit, I guess, if I'm correct in hearing this, I guess, as kind of a quick follow up, like you sort of, you know, encountered this work and kind of came to realize like how much you didn't know or how much you felt like it was just something that was like, I really want to like deep dive on this to be, as best equipped to do the work, but maybe also like kind of uh, advocate for the work. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. There was this moment, I think, if you're truly committed to identity work yourself, there's this moment where you wonder, what is my space within the work? What is the right piece? What is appropriate for me to do? How can I advocate? How can I utilize my privilege in spaces to make sure that students are receiving everything that they deserve and need to be successful in their experience at an institution? And also, at the end of the day, what are the recommendations to move this community forward, and then what are the recommendations to think of our residential experience and housing to provide an experience for all students no matter where they live. So for Black students, if they didn't live within the identity-based LLC, I had real questions about what that experience looked like and could be. So how do we strengthen the identity-based LLC, and then also, one, I mean, understand what is best for it, but then also, what about students that don't live there? Because students should have an opportunity to live all over across campus. They shouldn't feel a sense of obligation to be in one space based on their identity.
Mhm. Yeah, well, because I guess that's kind of the thing too. Is like I think holistically people would understand like why this is important generally for Black college students, but then like what do you think is sort of the aspect of it that makes it such an important topic for like res life in particular, because I think that idea of it being like a living and learning community, and yeah, you wouldn't want it to be obviously like, that students are sequestered there, but it could at least maybe, I guess my thought is like it would be maybe even more helpful for like first year students. It's maybe a catalyst where they find their community, then they can take it on, you know, elsewhere. But yeah, like why kind of focusing in on res life, like what's kind of the most important part of it in terms of that part of the college experience?
It's a great question. I residence life. Some of this was because residence life had been where I'd worked and lived and kind of put my passion in for years. I've worked in higher education for nearly 20 years. A large portion of that work has been in residence life. So I truly believe about how transformational that experience can be. Students certainly experience their college through their academic experience, but I would argue that their residential experience is often what drives them to stay. So when we think about student mattering, no matter who and what identities they possess, where they live and how they live in that experience really matters. And there's studies that say how much time they spend outside of the classroom and they spend in their residential experience. Where they live matters, right? Um, but when I'm thinking about this study in particular, there was this question that I was posing, but what it developed to is a cross comparison study. So it's a cross comparison of the experience of Black students in the identity based LLC, and it was compared and contrasted to that experience of their peers across residential housing, whether they lived in another living learning community, they lived in traditional housing. As long as they lived on campus, they were eligible for the study. And I think that that was a really helpful model because the research tells us that living learning communities are one of the most promising practices for first year students, particularly. But my question was, are all LLCs truly a promising practice for Black students? Where do identity based LLCs fall within that, right? So it was a thoughtful question both for my current institution, but I think a missing opportunity within the current research.
Well, because I guess I don't know if maybe you kind of were like wrestling with this idea too, where I'm thinking like, well, no, I guess it's kind of like what you're saying, because I'm like, yeah, like a lot of LLCs are just like, yeah, it's like engineering students, like we put them all together, or honor students, and that I guess what you're getting at is that for Black students in particular, there may be comparatively more benefit for them in terms of community building and mattering at the institution at large to be in a more identity focused living learning community, and again, at least maybe for like their first year, like you really leverage it in that way. Because I think like with a lot of resources, sometimes it could just be like, yeah, like tutoring, it's available for everybody, like we've built it, come along, and use it as you will. But then if you like really target it for a particular population that's like more like, going to benefit from it, like it kind of, you're personalizing, you're catering, you're directing a little bit more, that the strategy is a little bit more intentional. So do you think that that's something, I guess that's maybe kind of interwoven into this, is not that like some places might have a, Black identified student like living and learning community, and it's just like, come if you want all years and whatever. Like there's maybe like implications for a bit more of like a thoughtful strategy around it.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate your question because, there's a lot of ways that we can think of living learning communities. Living learning communities at the baseline are a community that's connected around an experience, right? So it's a cohorted group of students that live together around a shared experience. Traditionally, living learning communities are often around an academic experience. So I think they really started, you think about honors communities like you discussed, right? And there's real value in that as well. But in recent research, you look at you look at Ku's research specifically around identity-based living learning communities. His work is more about LLCs. He's definitely seeing real growth and support for African American students within LLCs. The challenge is that students are often, at the time that they're 18, wanting to dig into their own identity, however they define their identity. So the question isn't always, I want to dig into my academic identity. Often it's, I want to dig into my social identity. I want to dig into my race. I want to dig into how I identify as a human. And especially at a predominantly white institution, when I looked at this study, I thought a great deal about the concept of mattering. What what are the key elements that we need to consider at a predominantly white institution to help Black students matter? And I say that because a PWI was never built for Black students in mind. So when we think about the ideas of belonging, I went kind of back and forth initially of do I choose belonging or do I choose mattering within my conceptual framework in my literature review? And I chose mattering because I have a real fundamental question whether Black students ever believe and know that they can belong at a white institution, a predominantly white institution, because it simply isn't built for them. So, what I learned pretty quickly is that for Black students, they understand that. They understand that better than most. They're not coming to a predominantly white institution expecting to belong because who they belong to is each other. They don't always or necessarily feel that they're going to belong to the institution. So then I thought, well, maybe we can make actual real movement in the idea of mattering. I like, you look at the backgrounds of the concepts of mattering. Belonging, traditionally was very much based in white male students. This kind of traditional idea of what belonging can be. Mattering, on the other hand, was really designed for first generation, primarily female students. So while it was still white identifying students, I thought, this gives me a little bit more of a chance to understand it and maybe make it applicable. So within that, I learned a great deal. And I think the primary piece, whether you choose belonging or mattering as your framework of understanding for students, eh, the definitions need to be defined by the people themselves. So how we define them within literature may not be correct for Black students specifically.
Yeah. Well, that's what just it's making me think of too, is that like I think you really kind of threaded a needle in terms of Black student mattering at a PWI, like, and that sort of thing to really honor that almost kind of anachronistic that where it's like, oh, this place was literally not built with that sort of community in mind, but so it's like there's like a lot of value in the work that you did to build this dissertation, and then thinking like this, I mean, hopefully would almost, I feel like, provide like a template or inspiration for other people to kind of explore sort of interweaving of like, yeah, like, women students, first generation, and then certainly like how these things sort of intersect and those sort of things. And I certainly agree with kind of the implication of there being a difference in definition of like the word choice and everything. Cause I think, in my head as I was listening, I was like, yeah, it's kind of proving out kind of the classic idea of like a student who's more engaged in community with their peers at a college are more likely to persist and all that. But then there's a lot of uh, maybe headwinds or just sort of complicating factors as you start to move away from, yeah, like, obviously these like classic student affairs theories don't, I think, they're not super clear with articulating like who is this persona that they're talking about, but we can now kind of in hindsight know. So it's like, well, yeah, we do kind of need to add a little bit of form to kind of this like just bland sort of like uh, persona that is, there's nothing kind of distinguishing about it. And even though that kind of core theory can continue to be proven out, it sort of gives people kind of the uh, instruction manual for being like, okay, as you're, yeah, trying to uh, help a particular student population matter on your campus, like, and that should be something that you are uh, motivated to do as a decision maker at a campus. Like, it kind of just it gives you more of that detail and the context and the history and those sort of things. So I think it's yeah, just really interesting because I my mind kind of goes back to just like, okay, well, yeah, the leaders at institutions, I think they're all going to talk a big game, but then it's like, okay, like you're the one that's being like, okay, if you're ready to start doing the work, like here's some of those things that you can start to do to kind of, really kind of show your work to kind of live out your values, put your budget where your values are, kind of thing. Something I like to say. So, um,
It's a great question because what you're kind of driving to is belonging for who, mattering for who, and how. For Black students in this study, mattering showed up in two ways. One was very much in mattering to one another. It wasn't mattering to their white peers. It was mattering to one another in their Black identity. And then the second piece was institutional investment. And institutional investment can show up in a variety of ways, but really it's centering Black students within decision making. And I think about at any large institution, there's bureaucracy, right, in the way that decisions are made and reached, and the question mark for me always is who has access and who is driving the decision. So even in the name of this study, let us make it ours, Black students wanted to provide this experience and learn with and for each other. So, even in the study design, it was peer to peer. I love the reason I got into a doctoral program is because I love qualitative research so much. I mean, my background is in social work, it is qualitative driven. And I had to make a fundamental decision very quickly that if I were to conduct these interviews, it would stop students from sharing really openly and honestly their experience. That wasn't okay. So that meant that I needed to change my study design to be student centered in the way that the entire project and dissertation occurred. And I would argue in many ways, whether it's looking at theories of mattering or belonging, the question of to whom by whom matters, and then this point of to the institution, how we center that, if we're really about the work. But I say that because at a predominantly white institution, we're always going to be wrestling with those questions because it wasn't built for, right? So it was built for white students that often look like me. So there is this question fundamentally we should ask ourselves every single day about every process, every procedure, every way that we make decisions of who it's centering and who it isn't.
Yeah. Well, and I think, yeah, I guess I appreciate that was just all of your insights here, because I know that this is just sort of an area for me to learn and grow in, and I think, yeah, like I was definitely trying to build towards was that idea of the advice and strategies that you would recommend on this topic, and it just is great where you're kind of like bold underlining circle the idea of like these students need to be a part of the process because I think like one there may be a lot of institutions where they're not involved at all. Somewhere it's just like you'll do a listening tour just for optics, but then it's like okay, we want really want to get to kind of the pinnacle here and be in a place where these students are really informing the way that decisions are being made and strategies being developed and probably continually consulted and sort of included. So I think things like that, like what are other pieces of advice and strategies that you would recommend on this topic as people are kind of grappling and working through it?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I learned a great deal from this study. I mean, I learned whenever you do identity work, you learn as much about self as you learn about the process, right? So, recommendations one, self work is hard work. It's daily commitment to trying to understand what you don't know because whenever you're doing identity work it's a constant state of rediscover or discovering for the first time. So that's an ongoing commitment. I would say that first. Secondly, I ask myself all the time, am I the right person to do this? If I'm not, who is, and how do I open the doors to make so, right? Recommendations from this study, things that we found: if students lived in identity-based LLCs, they experienced the world of a PWI through a lens of mattering. And if they lived outside of the LLC, whether that be in another LLC, whether that be in traditional housing, whether that be in the housing that is the most popular on campus, they by and large experienced the institution through a lens of marginality. So it is in fact what they didn't receive that drove their experience, not what they did receive. And I would say fundamentally that changes how we consider our work, right? And how we center, who we center in the work, how we center our most underserved populations, because we know that our majority students will get what they need by and large if we can center our underserved students. So recommendations I would have immediately is thinking about power structures and systems, considering who has a seat and a voice at the table. And that's both within staff and then also structures for students. So in residence life, we often have systems that include RHA. Is there an advocacy board existing within RHA that is completely designed and created and supported by students of color? If there isn't, I would say we're missing an opportunity. Another thing that I think about too is the curricular approach. Often, when we're thinking about the curricular approach to learning within residence life and student affairs, we're really working to center social justice in some sort within that work. The question I would then ask, though, is it social justice in a matter of teaching white students, or is it social justice in creating opportunities for students of color to connect together? And those are two fundamental different questions. I think that many curricular approaches go to the step of we need to teach and educate our white students to be better supports and care places for our students of color and underserved populations. And that's important work, but then we're still not centering our students of color within the conversation. So those are two things that I immediately think of that are, I think, really applicable. And I don't want to say easy because they're not easy. It's hard work and it takes commitment, but it are strategies that really could get back to the sense of mattering for our underserved populations.
Would you have any advice? Like, do you think it'd be worthwhile, maybe like in tandem with those things, to like do student satisfaction surveying to try to get like kind of a baseline and to also measure like kind of the impact of efforts that you're making in these areas? Like, do you think that that's something would be helpful?
Yeah, I always think that assessment is helpful, right? One of the pieces of this study is that it's a small, very specific study to a current institution. So I definitely think that there is much opportunity to expand this in a larger way. Just my study alone, I would say that qualitative studies and focus groups I think are more critical. Oftentimes, populations, particularly for Black students at PWIs, are very small. So they get lost in larger quantitative studies, which is what a lot of institutions tend to focus on. So I would say really digging into focus groups, qual groups, thinking through the manner in which we provide studies. I think from an equity lens is really important. So how we gather data matters, right? Because it can tell us all sorts of things if we're looking for the right story. The other thing I will say though, we know that this is the case. Not just at CU Boulder. We know that this is the case across our institutions. And how we know that to be true is because our retention and persistence for Black college students at PWIs is in many ways not abysmal, where it's not where it needs to be. And that's only gotten harder since COVID. We're having a harder time to recruit and to retain our students of color at predominantly white institutions. So our data already tells us that this is a point that we need to grow in, that this is an opportunity. So I would say sometimes we sit in this place of, well, we need to wait for the data to tell us to act. And I would argue that we already have the data that tells us we should act.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So it's like if you're doing any of those things or all of those things to try to do some information gathering, like you should direct it more towards like, what do you think we should do? Because it's like, this is a problem. We need to improve it, or there's always room for, improvement and continuous improvement and things. So like, yeah, trying to get towards, really tangible, relevant information versus just like affirming what you should already know or, could easily find the information to support that. So I think that's really good. Uh, and last question, just because I think this is such kind of a deep, kind of full topic to explore. Are there any resources that you'd recommend folks check out? We'll certainly have ways to connect with you and everything, but yeah, just other resources that we could include in the show notes.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a lot of my research was based in affinity based work. So, when you think of cultural centers and the beautiful work that's been done for years and why cultural centers matter, from a theoretical place and a lit review place, I would say start there always. I think also, a real shout out to ACPA for the strategic imperative on racial justice and decolonization. The work that they are doing and have done for many years is really beautiful, thoughtful work. It really centers this idea of, it really takes all of us to make change, right? Because sometimes, especially as white staff, our question is how do we sit and advocate at the table? How do we appropriately utilize our privilege and understand our privilege to make change? And I think that from a liberation standpoint, it takes all of us to make change, right? Like we're dependent upon each other for liberation. So I would definitely say the strategic imperative, and also within that, there's some work that ACPA has been doing, a new publication coming out soon that really is, I think, crafted in many ways for white professionals in student affairs and higher education to support them within that journey. And it's kind of a like 2.0 to the strategic imperative. So I would argue that's a really important place to start. And then, this was I just got published, so you can read if you want to know more. There's 15 pages cut down from a labor of love. It was like my baby for years, but 15 pages within Akuhoai. So within the recent Akuhoai journal, you could take a look at that and always reach out to me, knowing that this work It's not my work. That's the whole point. This work is our students' work. And really, at the end of the day, we need to listen to our students because they know what they need. We just need to believe them.
It's a beautiful place to end the episode. So yeah, absolutely. I think it'll be great for folks to connect with you to keep the conversation going, and yeah, check out your work and those resources that you shared. And I think this is a great episode of ResEd Chat, a really important, relevant topic, and I just appreciate you doing the work and sharing it out, uplifting it, the voices of the students, and for hearing, hanging out with us here and sharing all that you did.
Thank you all so much. It was so good to see you today.